Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our 20th webinar of the 2020 year. It's really a great pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon for a very special presentation, Building the Post-Pandemic Workplace, Science-Based Lessons to Design Healthy and Safe Work for Your Employees. My name is Meredith Dalt, and I'm joined today actually by my cat Princess, because we're working at home. She will not get off my lap, so that's the kind of day it's going to be. I'm a business journalist at Smith School of Business, and I've been your host for these 20 webinars, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I want to remind you, as I always do, that today's webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. I also want to remind you that this conversation will be recorded. You'll see that recording button up in the top left telling you that we are being recorded. You're going to be getting a copy of that recording in your inbox within a couple of days after today's presentation. Finally, I do encourage you to ask questions. We don't have a ton of time for questions today, but Julian is a fantastic presenter and speaker, and I know that he always elicits a lot of questions. So if you do have questions, get them in early, get them in often, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time that's left over at the end of Julian's presentation. It's now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Julian Barling, who is no stranger to our webinar series. This is his second time this season, and he's a popular presenter. Dr. Barling is a professor of organizational behavior and the Borden Chair of Leadership and Stephen Gima Distinguished University Professor at Smith School of Business. He's an authority on transformational leadership and was recently named as one of the 10 most influential leadership researchers in the world. In 2002, he was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and named a Queen's Research Chair. Julian has received numerous awards for teaching and research, including the American Psychological Association, National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health Lifetime's Career Achievement in Research Award, woof, that's a mouthful, and the National Post's Leaders in Business Education Award. He is the author of more than 200 articles and 14 books, including The Science of Leadership, Lessons from Research for Organizational Leaders. We're very lucky to have him at Smith, and we're very lucky to have him presenting today. I'm going to go away, get this cat off my lap, and leave you to it. I'll be back to field questions at the end. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for finding the time to spend an hour with us. What I'd like to do this afternoon is to discuss what I think we should be targeting for a post-pandemic workplace. What I'd like to do this afternoon is I'm going to start with some thoughts about where the ideas come from. I'm then going to share with you some ideas for what productive and healthy work should look like, and what we should be thinking for a post-pandemic workplace. I'll end with a few different conclusions, and after that, be more than happy to take some questions. So, just some background. We're in difficult times, and what we know is that when uncertainty and ambiguity reign supreme, as I think they do now, people actively seek information. And it's specifically to help them quell that anxiety. Given that, I think it's perfectly understandable that one of the hottest topics for webinars, invited talks, and so forth this year, well, since mid-March, has been what work will look like in the post-pandemic era. I fell into that trap myself. On June the 18th, I delivered a webinar entitled, "What Will Work Look Like When This Is All Over?" And I've subsequently come to believe that therein lies the problem. So with just a few months of hindsight of giving that talk, I went back, I looked at the talk, and I now believe that many, if not most of our predictions will likely turn out to be inaccurate. And thus useful in planning for what will be the post-pandemic future. Why might they be inaccurate? Well, we're not really sure what the future holds, and trying to predict what work will look like after that is a precarious task indeed. So instead of doing a talk on what I think work and workplaces will look like, what I'd like to do this afternoon, based on decades of good organizational research, is share some thoughts on what work and workplaces should look like in a post-pandemic world. And let me start by saying that doing so this approach makes a conscious assumption, and that is that we're not just helpless victims of these current events. Instead, we have what might be a wonderful opportunity to make choices that will influence the nature of a post-pandemic work and post-pandemic workplaces. So a couple of comments about the kind of research that these ideas are drawn from. So well-known social science theories and research spanning 90 years, generated in both good times and, really importantly, in bad times as well. So starting with the Great Depression and continuing for at least 50 years after that, the work of Marija Hoda, somebody whose research I greatly admired, showed that people seek two things from work. The manifest function, the most obvious, which is that work will meet our basic financial needs. And for many decades, this seemed like something that we could take for granted with post-depression unemployment schemes, insurance schemes, and so forth. But I'm not so sure that it is something that people can rely on going forward. We see in the United States, for example, that unless Congress and the president can come to some kind of decision, many people will not be receiving any kind of financial benefits. And the manifest function of employment, for the first time in many decades, is going to be very challenging for hundreds of thousands of people. Just as importantly, work fulfills important psychological needs. And what Marija Hoda showed, and decades of research has supported, is that work provides us with a time structure. Why do weekends mean so much? Because we don't have work. Work provides us with important social contacts. And I think many people can appreciate right now how much we took that for granted. Work gives many people status. Work gives people a collective purpose, and we're going to get into that. And it gives people activity. We know from research that one of the things people lose when they become unemployed is physical activity. And we can no longer take that for granted. Maslow's theory, need hierarchy theory, and I would say that we all know Maslow's 5 basic needs. Maslow's theory is a very popular theory. I'm not sure if most people realize that it was generated in the middle of the Second World War. And Maslow and Hoda share something, and that is that their theories of psychological needs in the workplace and so forth were generated during periods of great deprivation. And Maslow's 5 needs suggested that as we fulfill physiological needs, we go on to be motivated by safety needs. I think pre-pandemic, many people who are attending this webinar were probably motivated by esteem needs and perhaps by self-actualization. And of course, since the middle of March, that has changed for many, many people. A study going back to 1971 showed something that is really important right now. And that is that as previously satisfied needs are no longer satisfied during periods of deprivation, people slid down the hierarchy, and that's diagrammatically presented in the second little picture here. For people who may have been motivated by esteem needs and so forth, safety may be far more paramount. And for some people, their basic physiological needs for shelter, for food and so forth, we know are now threatened. So employees today are facing a very, very different present and future than they were less than a year ago. I would just like to mention one other more recent theory, because it's going to be relevant during the presentation. A British psychologist, Peter Wall, set out what he regarded as his vitamin model of work and mental health. And essentially what this vitamin model suggests is that some vitamins, and if you just look at this graph, the more you take of them, the healthier you get. But for other vitamins, you can actually have too much of a good thing. In fact, for some vitamins, at a certain point, if you take more of them, they could jeopardize your health. This is going to be important when we talk about something like workplace autonomy. In general, having autonomy, having the ability to make decisions for yourself at work, is a very important feature both for productivity and for well-being. But what we now know is you can have too much autonomy. You can have so much autonomy that it paralyzes you at work. and it threatens your mental health. So that idea, that research is going to be important as we move forward. Aside from the research, I would just like to suggest that there are two other aspects that I think are important foundational points as we try and predict what work should look like in a post-pandemic world. Sarah Kessler, I don't know if anybody's written her amazing book called Gigged. Sarah Kessler made the point back in 2017 that we've been worrying about the end of work for 500 years, and we seem to be still worrying about the end of the work. Like Sarah Kessler, I would start off with the assumption that we will still be in a world of work post-pandemic, and we will still have people doing work, and people will still have essentially the same psychological needs that they want their work to fulfill. A second, I think, important point to remember comes from Jeff Pfeffer at Stanford. In a recent article that you can read in the Stanford Business Magazine, Pfeffer points out that COVID-19 changes everything and nothing about managing workers. So the ideas that I want to share with you today are predicated on decades of research and largely these two comments, that everything will change and nothing will change. Having said that, I guess what I'm going to do this afternoon is present this model of healthy and productive work to you. I think that I will try and make the case that there are 7 features of work that provide for productive and healthy work. And these will be, let's call it high quality leadership, having some autonomy in your job, a feeling of belongingness at work, a sense of fairness at work, the sense that you can grow and develop through your work, the sense that you're doing something meaningful and important at work, and that your safety is satisfied at work. I think these 7 features together will make up a healthy and productive workplace. So I choose to start with leadership, not because my research has been focused on leadership more than any of the other topics for the last several decades, but I think that leadership really is central in one important way. Whether employees have autonomies, have a workplace in which they feel a sense of fairness and so forth, really stems with leadership. It's up to leaders to decide to have those sorts of workplaces. Modern leadership theories, it doesn't matter which one you go to, all emphasize ethical, inspirational, developmental, and what I would call relational leadership. And if we try and translate that into what do people want from their leaders during pandemic times, when insecurity is so rampant, and we know these from really, really good studies, I think they translate into what I would call the 4 C's of leadership. I think what people are looking for in their leaders is consistency, calm, clarity, and compassion. It is a consistency that is born of an ethical choices made by their leaders. In good times, inspirational leadership is typically made up of people firing up their leaders. I think in more troubled times, the best of leadership is about calming your folks. It's about ensuring that people have clarity rather than the uncertainty that we seem to see today, and just about being compassionate. When I've done talks on this topic, one of the questions that is often raised, what about the 5th C, which is surely competence? Surely at this time, we're looking for competent leadership. And my response to that would be, during the worst of times, leaders' competence is taken for granted. If I can put that another way, you will accrue no leadership capital for displaying your competence. People just expect that of you. But sadly, you will be punished if you're seen to be incompetent. So if I can put it this way, I just take competence for granted at times like this. A fascinating study on what we need from leaders came out early in the coronavirus. So Kayla Sargent and Alexander Stoyakovich conducted a study, reported their study on data as of May the 5th in the United States with male and female governors. And here's what they show in these data. I think the important point for us is just this portion of the graph. So in states where by March the 23rd, there was a statewide order for some sorts of pandemic measures, the difference between states that had a male governor, which are these states here in blue, versus states with a female governor, in terms of COVID deaths, was just remarkable. States led by male governors were seeing vastly more COVID-related deaths than states led by female governors. Going further, what these two researchers tried to do was work out why this might be the case. So they undertook a mammoth task. They analyzed the speeches and press conferences of 38 governors, male and female governors, and found two very significant differences. And that was that female governors exude empathy and exude confidence far more than male governors. And the empathy that we're talking about is a greater awareness of others' feelings and a greater awareness of others' concerns about work and money, and obviously the present current circumstances and those going forward. And one of the quotes they use is the one shown on the screen by Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of, I'm blanking, but the governor of Michigan. So it's these simple things. It's something like empathy. It's not the big stuff. You'll see it are the simple things that may well differentiate these important outcomes. So what does it take to show that kind of leadership? Throughout the webinar, what I'm going to do is offer you the opportunity to engage in some polling questions. Let me explain why. The Gallup organization has a wonderful document out about creating an excellent workplace. What does it make to take a great workplace? And based on research of tens and tens of thousands of people, they came up with 12 items that would typify a great workplace. So for the first polling question, could you please respond to the following? It is one of the Gallup survey questions. In the last 7 days, I've received recognition or praise for doing good work. So if you could just do this polling question, please. And with about, well, more than 2/3 of the responses in, the pattern that we see is very gratifying. It would appear as if at least almost half the sample would agree or strongly agree, and only a few people would strongly disagree or disagree. So that would be a very pleasing profile. If we did this on a random or representative sample, I'm not sure the results would be as pleasing. So what does it take to display that kind of leadership? So let me tell you about a study done on fundraisers, which is a thankless call center task. And the study was conducted by Adam Grant, and it was done amongst university fundraisers. So what they had was a situation where, as a normal part of their work at the end of each day or week, everybody would receive performance feedback on the number of calls they were making and the amount of money that they were bringing in. And they divided these people into two groups. So the one would just continue to get their regular performance feedback, and the second group became what they referred to as the gratitude group. So they received performance feedback and then just the simple comment, I'm very grateful for your hard work. We sincerely appreciate your contributions to the university. 16 words. And they compared the performance feedback of these two groups in the following week. And they could show that those people in the gratitude group who heard these 16 words increased the number of calls they made by 50% in the next week. I think we would be surprised at how much appreciate our small acts of gratitude. In fact, we know that from certain studies. One study looked at the question of why don't we show our gratitude or show we care more often? And I think what we learned from the study is something really important, and that is we probably don't show as much gratitude because we undervalue just how much our small acts on our part can meaningfully affect other people. 3 specific findings they got in the study was we underestimate how surprised people would be about what we were grateful for. We overestimate how awkward they will feel if we do tell them we're grateful. And we just generally underestimate how appreciative others will be. So a significant feature as we go through the rest of these elements is just how little we might need to do to have a really meaningful effect on productive and healthy work. People aren't looking for us to do enormous things, particularly during troubled times. But perhaps especially because we're in troubled times, it is going to be the smallest things we do that have the greatest effects on others. So a comment I made earlier, leadership is critical for all these other characteristics in the model. And a last comment about leadership from Jeff Pfeffer. For employers, best practices during a pandemic are no different than before. Take care of your people. Moving on from leadership, I'd like to turn our attention to autonomy and start off with another polling question. So if you could just respond yes or no to the question, nobody knows the job as well as the person who does it. So nobody knows the job as well as the person who does it. So if we could just have a few more people responding, please. Okay, we've got about 2/3 of the group responding. So overwhelmingly, about 84% would agree that nobody knows the job as well as the person who does it. I should almost have warned you that this is a trick question, because if you agree with this question, then the point is, what are the direct implications of this for your management style? And if we agree with this, then surely we would be granting people more autonomy than we might expect is granted when we look at employee attitude surveys. So if we could just try a polling question from the Gallup survey. So this is for you. At work, I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day. So one of the 12 Gallup questions about what makes a great workplace deals directly with autonomy, and it's this question. So again, we have about 2/3 responding. And with 2/3 responding, about 65% would agree, or perhaps agree strongly, that they are provided with this opportunity to express their autonomy at work. And if you are, this is really important. Just thinking specifically about the pandemic. During the pandemic, control over your workload. We're hearing lots of stories about people working more than they ever were before, about your work schedule, about the pace of your work, and really importantly, about the place of your work. These have always been important, but I think they're especially important during the pandemic, when what we now see are large numbers of people who are working from home, but wish they were working from work, and who are working from work, but who wish they could work from home. In other words, whose autonomy about even where they work has been stripped away from them. At the same time, as more people work from home, and you might expect to have autonomy, this may not be the case. I actually read a report this morning, and the URL is at the bottom of this particular screen. Stories about how Microsoft 365 now has a feature where management can individually monitor people's work performance while they're at home. And as we know that autonomy is important, we seem to be working ways to try and limit people's autonomy. And the problem here is that granting people autonomy really tells them that we trust them. Introducing features into software that monitor their work really tells them that we distrust them and distrust them greatly. So the effects of autonomy on productivity and well-being have widespread support. decades of support. And let me just tell you really briefly about a study by Toby Wall and his colleagues, reported in 1990 in an advanced manufacturing site in the United Kingdom. So there were 3 phases to this particular site. So in the first phase, which took place over 50 days, they had what was referred to as a specialist control system in place. What this meant was you'd be working at your equipment. If anything went wrong, you had to stop work and call a specialist, in other words, your supervisor, who would come and fix your equipment. At the workers' behest, they decided, management agreed to try a system where they would have an operator control system. So after 20 days of training, they had a 50-day operator control system, which was really minimal. All it said was, if anything went wrong with your equipment, as the operator, you now had 15 minutes to fix it yourself, and you could call your teammates to try and help you fix it. And if you couldn't fix it, then you would call the specialist or your supervisor. So we're not talking about giving away the workplace. We're talking about 15 minutes to fix your equipment. And what they found was an immediate effect on productivity. So they found that downtime was reduced from 50 to 30 minutes per 8-hour shift. But over time, as people took more responsibility for their work, preventive maintenance started to occur. And what they found was that 12 months later, not only were these effects still present, but they were much greater, because people were now being able to estimate and predict when there would be problems and avoid the problems, so that downtime was actually reduced. In addition, what they could show was that feelings of job pressure, of work stress, and an increase in intrinsic job satisfaction also occurred during this phase. So just one of the many studies that shows that both productivity and well-being are improved by small amounts of workplace productivity, of workplace autonomy. Ignoring the first little bullet there, the notion that we should avoid giving people more responsibility because it's unfair if we don't pay them more is simply not correct, and it's counterproductive. Why? Because people, of course, they want more money, but in order to have work that is more productive and healthy, what they want is work that is more autonomous. Just 2 concluding thoughts. Of course, we should never give people more autonomy without prior training. Doing so may be incredibly dangerous. And we should remember also that too much autonomy can be harmful. The third workplace aspect that I think is really critical for productive and healthy work is just the sense of belonging. We've always thought that it's critical. It's been critical. We've known this since John Donne and his comment, "No man is an island" in 1624. Feelings of belongingness are even more critical at a time where normal social relationships and workplace social relationships have been disrupted so significantly. If we can just try the Gallup poll that reflects the need for belonging and the sense of belonging at work, they have one item that simply says, "I have a best friend at work." And just an important point, they're not saying my best friend at work. It's just a best friend at work. And with 2/3 of the group responding, we tend to see a more almost normal distribution for this notion of our belongingness needs being satisfied at work. And for the people who this was true pre-pandemic, this may no longer be true. And that's really important because, apologies, that may be an important point because what we know is that people satisfaction at work is in many cases more important than pay satisfaction. And this has significant implications for employee retention. When our favorite employees tell us they're leaving, perhaps the most frequent response is to offer to increase compensation, which may be less effective given that we know that people tend to leave because of people, and less because of pay. So we can also get an impression of just how important the feelings of belongingness are when we see what happens when they're no longer, when they're thwarted, when people's feelings of belongingness are thwarted in the workplace. So psychologist Jean Twenge conducted an intriguing set of studies to have a look at what happens when belongingness needs are thwarted. She looked at undergrads, she used undergrad students for this, and a whole bunch of undergrads were given a fake personality test, and they're given fake personality feedback. And there were two groups of people. So one group were given this kind of feedback. You're the type who has rewarding relationships throughout your life. The odds are you'll always have friends and people who care about you. But the second group were told that, in a sense, their belongingness needs would be thwarted in the future. In a somewhat harsh feedback, they were told, you're the type who will end up alone later in life. You may have friends and relationships now, but by your mid-20s, most of these will have drifted away. You may even marry or have several marriages, but these are likely to be short-lived and not continue into your 30s. Relationships don't last. The odds are you'll end up being alone more and more. What they then did was got both these groups to engage in an exercise with other people where they would have to give them feedback based on a task. And for the group that have told that they were likely to have their belongingness needs thwarted, they were significantly more likely to give them much more negative and much more aggressive evaluations. So our belongingness needs at work, satisfying those needs is really important because they maintain healthy social relationships. And from a leadership perspective, they enable us to perhaps be at our very best in terms of our leadership. My apologies, just trying to work out. Okay, so now we're moving on to fairness. And the Irish Prime Minister back in 1945 captured it quite well. It is indeed so hard, it is indeed hard for the strong to be just to the weak. And fairness is something that people want at work and expect at work. So how do people respond when they're being treated unfairly? We can just look to one study. It's almost a classic study by Gerald Greenberg to see the remarkable effects of even small amounts of unfairness. So this particular study was conducted in 3 geographically separated manufacturing plants in the Midwest of the US. It was the same company. And what happened was they lost some manufacturing contracts, as a result of which they would have to undertake, it appeared as if they would have to take a short period of layoffs in 2 of the sites. But what they decided was, instead of doing that, they would just have pay cuts for everybody in those sites, including people at the vice president level. They would have the same pay cut, and they could avoid any layoffs. So one plant experienced no changes in payment because they had no manufacturing contracts cancelled. Both the other 2 plants, for a 10-week period, everybody would receive the same 15% pay cut. But one group received what they called an adequate explanation. So a very senior person in the company came and had a meeting with everybody at that site. There were about 50 people at each site. And they had a meeting for 90 minutes. And as part of that 90 minutes, the person answered as many questions as they had. There was also an inadequate explanation where everybody got together, the 50 people at the site, and they had a 5-minute meeting. They were informed about the basics, and there were no opportunities to ask questions. But the amount of pay that they were cut was equivalent in both those groups. And here's what they saw. So just to explain these particular graphs, in the 10 weeks prior to the pay cut, all of those 3 groups, I guess, stole about the same amount of time. Employee theft or shrinkage was at exactly the same levels. This reflects the period during the pay cuts. So for the people with no pay cut, they just kept stealing at the same amount. For the people who had the adequate explanation, the 90-minute, they still had an increase in employee theft. But the people who had the inadequate, there was about double the increase in theft. A remarkable finding because it occurred in such a rapid period of time. But what's equally remarkable is as soon as the pay cut was restored, employee theft reverts to its same levels. They also looked at voluntary turnover in those groups. And again, each group has about 50 people. In the 10 weeks beforehand, all three groups had one person who left. In the 10 weeks during, the group with no pay cuts and the adequate explanation, either no one or one person leaving. But in the 10-week period that will get the unfairness treatment, 12 out of 50 people leave. And then as they restore fairness, voluntary turnover goes down to its normal levels. And I think the lesson from this study is that people are remarkably sensitive to the way in which they're treated, and they do respond accordingly. Just that small little amount of unfairness, a 15-minute explanation, a 90-minute explanation, had dramatic effects in terms of theft and voluntary turnover. Turning our attention, how do people respond to being treated fairly? In one study of over 6,000 male British civil servants, what they found was that perceptions of fairness were sufficient to result in fewer new instances of coronary heart disease 3 to 4 years later. The study is published in a major medical journal. And that's a staggering finding. But what's most important is the 5 questions that assessed fairness are so revealing. Here are these 5 questions. Do you ever get criticized unfairly? Do you get consistent information? Do you get sufficient information? How often is your superior willing to listen to your problems? And do you ever get praised for your work? I don't think it would be asking too much for people to, for example, get sufficient information, ever get praised. Small amounts of fairness have very significant effects on well-being, and small amounts of unfairness have very significant effects on workplace performance. People's needs for growth and development. Employees have always viewed the workplace as an opportunity for growth and for development. A psychologist, Clayton Alderfer, 50 years ago, said that we could even simplify Maslow's theory. Instead of 5 needs, what people brought with them to work was the existence needs, which is your safety and physiological needs, relatedness, which is your belongingness needs, and then growth, which is esteem and self-actualization. And how important are these growth needs? 3 of the 12 Gallup questions focus on growth and development. 3 of the 12. So let's just try one of them in a polling question. So if you could just respond to this question, there is someone at work who encourages my development. There is someone at work who encourages my development. And with almost 2/3 responding, with 2/3 of the folks responding. So it's about 50%, a little bit lower than what we saw in the responses to the last questions. The other questions in the last 6 months, someone at work has talked to me about my progress. And this last year, I've had opportunities to learn and grow. People are not looking for daily opportunities. They're not looking for unrealistic opportunities. They're looking for those small little opportunities. And there's one study which shows this, the effects of opportunities for growth, I think, in vivid detail. It's a study of 9,500 salaried employees from a very large high-tech manufacturing company in the USA. And they had a program for reimbursing people for participating in higher education. And here's what they found. So I'll just take you through what this graph means. This red line is people who, in a sense, participated in higher education and the company paid them back. So what's true for all groups over a 5-year period is people leave the organization, but that rate of people leaving was significantly less if the company allowed you to get a graduate degree and then promoted you because of the education that you'd received. The green line is for people who took just classes, no degree, and the company reimbursed them, again, retention is significantly higher. This jagged line here shows you what you would expect for people, a retention profile over a 5-year period. What's very revealing is this particular blue line. These people took classes. They were under the impression that they were reimbursed. They were under the impression, they believed that they'd taken classes to get promoted, but then they didn't. And what happened is their profile looks like those that get a degree, get reimbursed and get promoted. And when they realize that they're not getting promoted, then they leave. To them, the promise of getting promoted, of growth and development was broken. So people respond well to the opportunity for growth in the workplace. Turning our attention to meaningfulness. Having meaningful work, we know predicts work performance and health. If we can just try the Gallup question quickly. The mission or purpose of my company makes me feel my job is important. And we have almost 2/3 responding. So what we see is about 75%, I think, have the privilege of feeling that their work is meaningful. And this is really important because, again, we know that meaningful work enhances work performance and health. But what does it take to make people feel that their work is meaningful? Another study conducted by Adam Grant, again on fundraisers, showed how small the changes are that we need to make to help people feel that their work is meaningful. So in a separate study on fundraisers, the people who did the calling were placed into 3 groups, and all were invited into a break room for 20 minutes. One group was the control group. They were just told that callers were had often asked for more information about the impact of their work. Then there were 2 important experimental groups. We can call the one the personal benefit group. What they were told, they were read 2 stories by former fundraisers about how the work had helped their own careers. So people who used to be fundraisers and had shared stories about how being a fundraiser had helped their own careers. The task significance group, the meaningful group, were read stories by current scholarship students, and the callers were told how the scholarship students had benefited from their work, from the callers' works, how essentially they'd been able to stay at university because they'd received a scholarship. So one group were told how they would benefit. The other group were told how their work benefits others. And the results of the study are revealing. Adam Grant looked at 2 different aspects. So essentially, no real differences in the control and the personal benefit group. But for the task meaningfulness group, the number of pledges that they managed to get in the week or so after that minimal intervention more than doubles, and the dollar amount per donation more than doubles. And it raises the question, what are the smallest things we can do to help people feel that their work is meaningful? Because it's important. A quick side comment, do studies like this help resolve what I would regard as the Maslow versus Viktor Frankl debate? I'm not sure if you've read Frankl's book, In Search of Meaning, but Maslow insisted that the pinnacle of motivation is self-actualization. Frankl insists that the pinnacle of motivation is helping other people find their own meaning. And I think the research is coalescing around the notion that Frankl may have been more astute in his predictions. The final need is the need for safety. And it's always been an issue. You can go back and look at the history of unions if you want to see something intriguing, the history of unions and what they've always fought for. Go and watch Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, a fantastic movie from the mid-30s, and watch how safety was a significant issue in that particular movie. We've discussed Maslow. Were safety needs being met pre-pandemic? If we just look at Canadian data from 2018, over 250,000 lost time injuries in Canada in that year, and over 1,000 workplace fatalities in Canada in 2018. Of course, during the pandemic, the need for safety, so the need to know that you can go to work and at the end of the day, you can go home safe and healthy, has simply become that much more important for many workers. It is clearly an ongoing concern, not just for healthcare workers, but for many essential workers are concerned about their basic safety needs on a daily basis. For management, the pandemic has raised a significant issue in many cases, and that is, how do you manage safety in people's own homes? It's a very significant challenge. You can't inspect their workplace, and yet you're responsible to ensure that they work safely. To what extent has safety been compromised during the pandemic? If we look at the Canadian Institutes of Health Information data, and the most recent data I could find was June the 23rd, 21,842 healthcare workers had contracted COVID-19. Just to appreciate the enormity of that, that means that workplace absence in Canada for 2020, if we just take those data, if we don't look past June the 23rd, will increase by 2,110 days, because for each one of those healthcare workers, they would be required to isolate for 10 days, 10 work days, 14 days in total. So how much work is being lost just because people are contracting the virus? If we look at the United States, by today, these are today's data, 1,413 healthcare workers have lost their lives because they went to work during the pandemic. What that means is that this year alone, we will see a 25% increase, a minimum of a 25% increase in the annual workplace fatality rate in the US. And that is not accounting the people who will die between now and the end of the year. The URL at the bottom of this page is a fantastic update of the situation with healthcare workers in the United States. But what this tells us is that people for whom safety was always an issue, for a smaller group of people, safety at work is now an acute issue, a very significant issue. And the extent to which workplaces can do what they can to resolve that issue will see an increase in productive and healthy work. Importantly, we know from research, we conducted studies that show that transformational leaders can make a difference in safety performance. How does this work? Transformational leaders who emphasize safety help employees focus on safety and improve the safety climate in their organization. They help employees become more conscious about taking safety precautions, about making sure that other people take safety precautions. And both this increased consciousness and the changed safety climate in the organization result in fewer negative safety-related events that in turn result in fewer injuries and in some case deaths. So a comment we started with, leadership is important because it affects all of these individual issues, autonomy, fairness, growth, but also has an indirect effect on safety at a time where many employees think that safety is a significant issue for them in their daily work. So some concluding thoughts as we move towards what a post-pandemic workplace should look like. One thought is that women and members of historically disadvantaged groups have been disproportionately hurt by the pandemic. And as we start to redesign work for a post-pandemic workplace, I think we have the opportunity to ensure that our workplaces of the future must now benefit all their members. It is well past the time where our workplaces benefit some and disadvantage others. A comment about all seven of those elements. The research shows strongly that every single one of them can be done. People are not looking for the unreasonable from their leaders. They're not looking for full autonomy. They're looking for small amounts of fairness. All of these elements are doable in the workplace. Are some of them more important than others? No, I don't think so. I think that workplaces can choose which elements are, I guess, more consistent with their DNA, because it's the small changes they make that will help them move toward healthy and productive work in the post-pandemic workplace. Do you need all 7 characteristics to have a healthy and productive workplace? I think the answer is not at all. Employees don't expect to go to work for perfect and find perfect workplaces. But what they do expect is that organizations do what they can reasonably to make work more healthy and more productive. A thought not for today is, what does this mean for gig work and for self-employment? And I think that that is something that as organizational researchers and so forth, we're going to have to confront in the very near short term. So finally, a big challenge. If I can issue a big challenge, it is, what are the smallest possible things we can do going forward to build healthy and productive workplaces? And I hope what I've done today is to provide some ideas of what we can start to think about doing as we move forward. Thank you very much. And I look forward to trying to answer some of your questions.
Thank you, Julian. My first question, which I'm sure the audience also has, is good. Did you drink all that coffee this morning?
I wish. No, I didn't.
Okay, we don't have a lot of time, so I want to get to these questions. First, many organizations are contemplating or are already declaring that they will never go back to the in-the-office work model. Are they underestimating the role that attending work in person plays for their employee, and will we see a backtrack down the road?
So I think that what we're doing is underestimating the pent-up demand that the need for belongingness is placing on people. The notion from Sarah Kessler that we've always thought, the discussion about work disappearing has been going on for 500 years, and yet work remains. We heard very much of the same discussion after 9/11, where there was lots of thoughts about people aren't going to congregate in big cities, in big buildings and so forth. That didn't last that long. I suspect that, a lot has changed, but human nature hasn't changed. So I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that it's going to be feasible to continue this in the long term. I think that the surveys that we're seeing done on large representative samples tend to suggest that people's belonging needs are no longer satisfied and they're looking to go back to work.
Okay. Earlier, you talked about the importance of showing gratitude to staff, to employees. This person asks, is there a limit to how much before it seems disingenuous?
Yes, there definitely is. So I guess my advice would be, if I can put it this way, if you don't mean it, don't do it. And in all the leadership work I've done, the research, the leadership development, working with leaders and so forth, I'm confident that actually the problem that we're dealing with is not that leaders, they've heard this now and they're going to go out and they're just going to drown their people in gratitude. I just don't believe that's going to happen. I think that that's not the big problem. The big problem is that we're still going to face the issue that leaders might start to begin to understand just how important it is and still miss the opportunities to do it when they mean it. So if you mean it, do it. If you don't mean it, don't do it. It's really important. Employees can tell the difference.
Okay, and then that's great. Further to that question, on your point of gratitude, do you feel like high performing people are more likely to receive gratitude because they more frequently exceed expectations? And then what is the impact of gratitude on lower performing staff relative to higher performing staff?
Sure. So let me try and answer this, starting at the back, and then it's not a flippant comment, but there's a comment in The Muppets Take Manhattan, the movie The Muppets Take Manhattan, and the comment is, people are people. And I'm not sure it matters much whether you're so-called a high-performing person or a low-performing person. People have the need for recognition. So I think that I would say there's really not much difference. There is a difference, however, I think, in the fact that we take for granted after a while that high-performing people will just continue doing it in the absence of recognition and gratitude. And I think that one of the challenges is to express this another way. There's the old maxim that 90% of managers' attention is focused on poor performing people and 10% on the good, the high performing people. The tendency is to leave them alone because they're high performing. And I think we risk them not being high performing in the long term. So don't neglect them. they have the same needs as other people.
Right. Thank you. What is it about transformational leaders that makes them champions for safety performance?
So in some cases, they've had if I can call it, a brush with safety. So what we're talking about are transformation leaders who have a predominant focus on safety. They may have had a brush with safety. It could be a personal brush. They may just realize right now how important safety is for people. It's about appreciating, in a more general sense, it's about appreciating what your employees' current needs are. And for some people who are in essential work, who are in healthcare work right now, the data honestly are alarming. There's no other word for it. And it's about responding to their needs in their moment and having the astuteness and the intuition to do that.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. Are there studies on how people feel about belonging after they retire from work? Do they transition to belonging elsewhere, or does that loss of employment change everything?
So there is a very, very vibrant literature on retirement. And like to try and summarize it in a little saying or whatever, and healthy retirement consists, you don't retire from something, you retire to something. So for example, we know that people who make more successful transitions to retirement, actually there are some indications. We know that what they do is manage to fulfill the same needs that Jehoda was talking about in a research on unemployment in the 1930s. So what is it? So their financial security is guaranteed, is a strong word, but they're okay. They have a time structure. They have some level of status. They're involved in activities. So it's those same needs. So when they're no longer satisfied at work, these are people who've planned for them to be satisfied elsewhere.
Great. Gosh, Julian, as always happens with you, the questions are coming in fast and furious right now, and they're great questions. We have 3 minutes to the end. I want to see if we can squish this one in. Can you elaborate on the idea of too much autonomy? How do we help employees who feel disconnected? I don't know if those are one and the same or two separate things.
Well, I think they're somewhat separate. So just a quick comment about too much autonomy. One of the ways we can help people with autonomy is to ensure that they get training for what they do. My concern is that what we've seen in the pandemic is as people work from home, they have more autonomy. They're also going to be monitored more in the future, I think. But also they may be getting less training. And I think that's a dangerous combination, less training and more autonomy. People can take on more autonomy if they get more training. I think that that's just one quick response to the question, and I forget the second one. Sorry, Meredith.
Sorry, how do we help employees who feel disconnected?
It's one of the, in a sense, the big challenges for organizations right now. How do we try and do via Zoom what you were doing before, but that's not enough, because I think that one of the things, people say the productivity hasn't been affected. I think our productivity studies will show in the medium to long term that we underestimate how much has been lost in those chance meetings in hallways where people share ideas, because we don't have chance meetings anymore. We only tend to have planned meetings. So, I've dealt with executives whom 6 months into the pandemic are still very reticent to use Zoom and join in a sense, remote meetings and so forth. I don't think we can take it for granted. And I think that every little bit that we can do will make a difference. Don't feel that you have to replicate the whole workplace all at once. You cannot. But what are the small things that you can do?
Okay. Boy, we are out of time. Somebody has asked if we could provide a list of executive programs that you're going to be involved in the next year or so. Do you know that? This person writes, other than the leadership one I currently find online, do you have a sense of any of the public offerings? It's perhaps a nice segue into my promoting Queen's executive education.
So, offhand, no, I don't. Aside from the leadership ones.
Right. Okay. So what we can say is just to keep your eyes on. Here comes the URL, Queen's Executive Education. Because what I always do at the end of these webinars is promo the fact that we do offer lots of online learning opportunities at Smith School of Business through Queen's Executive Education. In January, there's a program called Leading Through Crisis, and it will provide some practical frameworks and industry best practices that you'll be able to apply immediately to leading during this pandemic. So check out smithqueens.com/execed. Gosh, that was our very last webinar of the 2020 year, which is remarkable to me. We have done 20. We started doing these immediately upon the shutdown in March and have had such fantastic uptake from our audiences and great attendance. And we've had some fabulous guests. So we're really grateful to everyone who's been able to attend and participate and ask questions. It's all helped us feel part of this a community, which I think is a great thing for feeling like we belong to something. We will be back in January with some new offerings, so do keep your eyes on your inbox. You'll be hearing more about what we have coming up. In the meantime, there's lots of great content you can dig into on the Smith Business Insight website, so do check that out over the next few weeks or months if you're missing me and our lovely guests. Julian, thank you so much for your fantastic and useful insights today. I know they'll be very valuable for a lot of people. Thank you to our audience for attending, and I'd like to just say, have a lovely afternoon and a great rest of 2020. Here's hoping things look up as we move into 2021. Thanks, Julian.
Everybody.